welcome to the Upcycle Design Lab. My name's Cindy and I craft using recycled and repurposed materials. If you're new here, I hope you'll stick around and check out some of my other upcycling tutorials. And if you like what you see, you can check the subscribe button below any of my videos to become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to be notified when I upload new videos, be sure to check the bell icon as well. So today I have a really simple sewing project. I'm taking a plain women's knit top and some men's t-shirts to make a more flouncy, frilly, fun top. So this is the shirt I'm starting with, and like I said, I have some men's t-shirts that I'm also going to be using to make what I hope looks like something similar to this shirt. And like I mentioned, it is a pretty simple sewing project, but the measurements get a little bit tricky, so I would recommend drawing a quick and simple sketch like this one to write some of your measurements down on. The first measurement is the length of the top piece, and the initial measurement will be for the finished or sewn measurements, and once we've figured out all of those measurements, we'll go back and add the seam allowances. So you want to measure from the shoulder just below the bust line and mark a spot with a straight pin. And I'm going to demonstrate how to do that. You probably want to hit kind of right here. I happen to know that I need mine a little bit longer because I'm a little bit bigger than the dress form here. But you're just going to take a straight pin and your tape measure. And put a pin just under the bust line, which is about 12.5 inches here. And then you just repeat it on this side. You could do this in front of the mirror with the shirt on as well. And you're just going to mark those two spots, and then we'll take it off and lay it out flat and double check our measurements. The second measurement that you want to write down on your sketch is the total finished length of the top. So to figure out that number, I would recommend finding a shirt in your closet that you like the length of, and then just doing a similar measurement. So you're going to measure from the shoulder all the way to the hem. And this shirt is 28 inches, but I know that I want to make mine a little bit shorter, so I'm going to work with a 27-inch finished length for my shirt. So the two measurements that we figured out so far are this dimension here from the shoulder to here, and my number is 15 inches. So I'm just going to draw that in. And then I also know what this top dimension is from the shoulder, or what I want it to be, to the bottom hem. So that's 27. So in order to get the distance or the length of my ruffles, I want them to be the same dimension. So they'll be the same size. So I'm just going to take the 27 minus 15, which leaves 12, and then I divide that in half and get 6 inches for each of my ruffles. And I'm just going to draw that in like that. So the next thing I want to figure out is how long, or the width of all of my two ruffle pieces. And to do that, I'm going to go back to my black top and take a quick measurement there, and then do some more math to figure out the width of my two ruffle pieces. So I've got my top piece laid out flat here, and I'm going to measure across the garment where I have my straight pins. So I'm just going to lay it across here. And you can see I'm getting 19 inches, but I want the number to be the full circumference of the shirt. So I'm going to double that number for the back part of it too. And then my number will be 38 inches. So I'm going to go back and note that on my sketch as well. So this distance from here to here is 19, and I want to multiply that by 2 So my number is 38, and that's the number I want to work off of. So one other thing I want to do to fill in my sketch is just to remind myself what colors I'm putting where. So my top piece is the black piece. Then I have a light gray t-shirt that I'm going to use for the middle ruffle. And I have two dark gray t-shirts that I'm going to use for my bottom ruffle. So you can determine how full you want your ruffles to be. The design that I'm copying, the ruffles don't look very full, so I'm going to use the ratio of 1 to 1.5. And by that I mean that I want my middle ruffle to be 1.5 times the 38 inches that it's gathering into. So I'm going to multiply 38 by 1.5 and I get 57 inches for this bottom ruffle. Now hopefully I'm not going to lose you too much, but I want to measure my light gray t-shirt before I go any further. So I've got my light gray shirt laid out fairly flat here, and I'm just going to be using the width of it here. It's a nice big long, it's going to be a nice long piece because there's no side seams in this shirt. So the only problem is when I measure it, it only comes out to 27, a little over 27 inches, which means it's only going to be 54 inches in circumference. So I could piece two pieces together to get exactly to my 57 that I measured, but because we're gathering it and it doesn't have to be perfect, it's going to be just a little bit less full. I'm just going to use one piece at 54 inches. So I just want to change my little sketch and use the 54 instead of the 57 to calculate my next ruffle from. So I'm just going to change my number here to 54. And then to finish my math, I'll multiply my 54 times 1.5, and that gives me 81 inches. So my bottom ruffle needs to measure 81. Again, so I probably have enough to do two pieces from one t-shirt, but because I'm being kind of lazy, I want to use the hem on the bottom of these shirts for the bottom of my shirt. So I've matched up the color as close as I can between the two t-shirts, and they have a fairly similar hem stitch as well. So I'm going to use one bottom hem for the front and the other bottom hem for the back piece, and then I will cut those and seam them to the 81 inches. I'm going to kind of work backwards now from the bottom up to the top as we do the cutting. So I'm working with one of the dark gray t-shirts for the bottom ruffle of my shirt. And I want to go, first of all, I just want to pin my hem together so that it's nice and even, so that I get a nice even cut, and the hem will hang evenly once it's sewn to the middle ruffle. So I'm just pinning the hem together so that it is at the same length here. And I've got my cutting mat and my rotary cutter and a ruler. And I do want to be sure I'm referring to my sketch. Now I'm not worried about the, I guess this is actually the width of the ruffle at this point, because I'm going to have extra on the dark gray shirt. But I do want to make sure that I'm measuring the right height or length. I'm going to get it smoothed out on my cutting mat here. And my finished piece needs to be 6 inches, but I want to be sure I'm adding some seam allowance also. And a normal seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, so I'm just going to measure from the bottom. Now normally you'd want to add in some length for the seam allowance or for the hem, but since we're stealing the hem, we don't have to add anything to the bottom. So I just want to add uh, 5/8 of an inch, or I'm going to use a whole inch just because I want a little bit more play. I'm going to need to do some gathering stitches to ease the ruffles together. So I'm just going to give myself a little bit of extra, and I'm just using a white gel pen here to mark where I want to cut the t-shirt. So my t-shirt's a little bit wide for my cutting mat, but I still want to kind of cut it in two parts, I guess. I want to line up the hem straight with my cutting mat. Make sure I've got everything really smooth. And then I'll line up my long ruler with the marks that I've made and use my rotary cutter to cut the t-shirt. So I'll just repeat that same process on the other dark gray shirt, and then we'll be ready to cut the light gray shirt. So I'm going to do a similar cut on my light gray t-shirt. The only difference is I want to be sure to add a seam allowance to the top and the bottom of the piece, and I want to cut off the t-shirt hem to get it out of my way. To cut the top of this shirt, I'm going to do it a little bit differently. I don't want to use my rotary cutter because I want to do a little tiny bit of a curve on the back so that the back of my shirt is going to be longer than the front, just a little bit. So I want to go ahead and line up my ruler on my pins, adding my seam allowance. And then I'll mark the shirt. And I'm just going to cut through the top layer of the shirt. Going to take a little nip here and cut along my line. All right, so I have my shirt laid out nice and flat here. I've got the back part of the shirt still on, and what I want to do is just draw a tiny bit of a curve on the back piece. So I'm going to start in the center and just add about a 1/2 inch is all I want, just a tiny little bit. And then I'm going to take my curved ruler, I think they're called dressmaker's rulers, and I'm just going to draw a nice gentle curve back up to the side seam. And then I'll cut along that line, and the back of the shirt then should turn out just a little bit longer than the front. The last cuts I need to make before we start sewing are to cut my 2 dark gray pieces, because the total circumference that I want for my bottom ruffle is finished at 81 inches. So I've got 2 doubled pieces here, so it means half of 81 is 40 and a half. So I want each piece to be 40 and a half, but they're doubled over. So I'm going to half that again and mark them at 20 and a quarter plus my seam allowance. So I've got 20 and a quarter, and I'm using about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I only need to add 1/2 inch because I'm adding it to both sides at the same time. So I've opened up my pieces, and I'm just going to pin them together on each end, and then we'll be ready to go to the sewing machine. So like I said, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my 2 dark pieces on the ends to make a big tube, and then I'll go back and I'll do the gathering stitches. So I've got my dark gray sewed into a big tube, and I'm going to start on one of the side seams. I want to make sure I have some nice long tails on my thread, and that I'm using the biggest stitch I can. And I'm going to stitch along the top side, not the side with the hem. At about a 1/4 inch from this side seam to the other side seam, and then I'm going to start a new thread so I can pull the gathers from more than one place. Now some people like to do this and some people don't bother when they're doing the gathers, but it's always safest just to put another row of gathering stitches in case one of your stitches breaks. So I'm going to go back around and do one more row all the way around. So you can see my 2 rows of gathering stitches there. So my next step is just to mark my sides of my light gray piece. I'm using a disappearing marker. I'm just going to mark both folds here. And I like to have one more measurement, so I'm going to fold it in half again. And make a mark there as well. So I've got it marked kind of in quarters. And then on my dark gray piece, I've got my side seams to mark my sides, and I just need to fold it in half and mark the center of that. I'm going to use pens for this because they're a little darker. So I'm just dividing this into rough quarters as well. and then I can match up my marks and try to gather the dark gray into the light gray as smoothly as possible. You want to be a little careful when you're pinning because your knits have a tendency to curl up a little. Just make sure you're getting your edges even and the gathers as smooth and even across the piece as you can. So I've got this first quarter section done. I'm just going to keep working my way around until I get the piece pinned all the way around so the tubes are all the way hooked together. So I've got the two pieces pinned together, and I'm going to go back and I'm just going to hand baste along the seam here so that I can go ahead and use the sewing machine to sew them together. But I'm going to baste them first, then I'll put my two gathering stitches on this end and pin that to the top and baste the whole thing together. So I've gotten the ruffles basted together onto the shirt, and the last thing I'm going to do is add the little ruffle to the sleeves. So to do that, I'm just using the same measurement of 1 to 1.5 for the ruffle, and it turns out that the bottom part of the black t-shirt was just the right amount for each side, so I just used the hem to make the ruffle for the sleeve. So I'm going to finish up the other sleeve ruffle, baste the two sleeve ruffles together, and then I'll be ready to do the final stitching. So I'm ready to sew the whole thing together with my final stitching, and a couple of things. You want to like I said, you want to be sure you're using a ballpoint needle for knits. And the other thing, when you're sewing ruffles, I like to sew with the ruffle side up so that I can just make sure that I'm keeping things as smooth as possible, and that some of the extra fabric isn't getting tucked up under the needle and causing sort of bumps. So I like to keep the flat side on the bottom and the ruffles on the top. And the other thing is that when you're sewing knits, some machines have stretch stitches, but if you don't have one, you just want to make sure that you're pulling gently on the knit so that once it's sewn, it will still have a little bit of give and you won't pop the stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and just carefully sew my whole shirt together, and gently pulling on it so that it'll still have a little stretch, and making sure that my gathers stay smooth. So once you've done your final stitching, you can go back and remove all of your gathering stitches and your basting stitches and just clean up the raw edges and the inside of your garment. Alright, that about wraps it up for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please do give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, I hope you'll consider becoming a subscriber. Thanks again!